Hello, this is Gail from Burger Sewing and Vacuum, and welcome to another edition of Foot Fetish. And today I'm going to talk about our stitch in the ditch foot and our edge joining foot. And you notice that both of them, they have a bar down the center. And so this is to help you either stitch in the ditch, which is a seam, or use it as an edge guide or stitching two things together. First I'm going to talk about the edge joining foot. And a couple ways that I use this is I use this a lot for top stitching. And I'm going to go ahead and put it on my machine. And I'm working on the crescendo today. And if I'm going to do top stitching, what I love about this foot is I can line things up right along that edge and then move my needle over. So I'm going to move my needle over however much I want to get a nice top stitch. And so what I'll do now is I just guide into that center guide and I still haven't changed my needle if you've seen some of my other ones, and this fabric there's a lot of sizing in it, so it's making more noise than I want. But now you can see that I have a nice straight top stitching, and it's nice and perfect and beautiful. I use my edge foot for that all the time. And let's pretend this was like a waistband or something like that. If I wanted to tack my waistband down, I would put it on the other side, and now I'd move my needle the other direction. You can see my needle is moving. I'm going to move it over however far you want it to be. You can put it so close to that edge where it's just on that edge. I probably need to slow the machine down a bit. And you notice that I'm guiding once again into there, and a lot of times I'll use my awl or my tweezers or something to keep my fabric down, and then I can just sew right along there. And what's nice is I'm not paying a whole lot of attention to the needle. I'm paying attention to this guide right here and the edge of my fabric. And that's what I'm paying attention to right now. And you can see now when I sew this down, look how beautiful that is. Nice and perfect, right down where I want it to be. So how else would I use my stitch in the ditch foot? I have a couple, these are some little purses I made, and what I did is on these, and I'm not going to actually do it, and the purse is too wide for me to do it. I'm going to take that foot off to show you. What I did is when I put my zippers on, and I sewed all these zippers down to a piece of fabric, what I did is I just put the zippers right up against left and right of that bar, and then I did a two-step zigzag right over that, and that sewed down all these zippers. So I used it for that purse. Here's another one that I did. Here's a bigger version of it. And you can see I did fancy stitches on this one. So I did use fancy stitches with this foot. And I just kept this right between the two zippers. And that way it was nice and even on both sides. So you can use it for sewing two pieces, edge joining, which is kind of what they mean it to do, as this is your edge joining foot. And you also have markings you can look at them, and it shows you markings 1/4 inch in front, 1/8 of an inch where it is and on the back. So you could even use this to sew down a binding on your quilt or anything you need to have an edge guide. So now let's talk about our stitch in the ditch foot. Here's our stitch in the ditch foot. Kind of ran off on me, so I had to go find it. And the stitch in the ditch foot is where you want to sew right down in a ditch. Now, some of you may say, well, what is the ditch? Well, the ditch is a seam. So if I wanted to sew this down, let's pretend this is a waistband or something, because not all these are just for quilting only. And I'm going to actually put it back in the center position. So now it's in the center position. So if I were to sew now, it's going to sew right along what they call the ditch. And so now I'm going to sew, and it's going to sew right down that ditch. Now, of course, if I were to use my edge joining foot, and it depends on what I'm doing. I do like the stitch in the ditch foot if I'm actually going to be sewing in the ditch. And if I wanted to sew off of it a little bit, I would use my edge joining foot, because that way I can move my needle a little bit more. Now this one I can move my needle a little bit because it does have an oval hole. So if I wanted to bring it off just a little bit, I can't go that far because it's just a small oval hole. I could move it off to the side just a little bit to catch that fabric, and I'll show you that in just a second if I could keep it straight. So if you look at this one, so first I'm sewing right along in that ditch, and then I move that needle over just a little bit. You can see I moved it over just a little bit so I could just barely catch the fabric. So those are the 2 feet, and I do use them for, sometimes I use them for the same things. I can stitch in the ditch with this one also, but this one, it gives me more ability to go back and forth, and I can use wider stitches on that, so I can do fancy stitches. And this one, I can move my needle over just a smidge, but I do love this for stitching in the ditch. It's nice, it gets me right there in that ditch. The bar's right there in the center, and I can go pretty fast, and it's accurate and beautiful. So these are the 2 feet, the stitch in the ditch foot and the edge joining foot. So until next time, happy sewing.